Hello, everyone. So right now we're going to be talking about the characteristics of dyslexia. You probably couldn't, it's not possible that you get this far in the Gordon program and not have thought deeply about what dyslexia looks like. You read the book Overcoming Dyslexia by Sally Shaywitz. You took the class 640 differentiation remediation and talked deeply about dyslexia and dysgraphia. But now with the reading, that might have been a little vague for you, depending on where you work and what experience you have in the field. Now we're going to go deep in the seminar or in the reading clinic because you'll have a chance probably to see somebody with that dyslexic profile. When I used to think of dyslexia as like this, ooh, this mysterious thing that I may or may not ever see in my practice. And the more comfortable I grew with the definition of it, and the more comfortable I grew in trusting myself as a reading specialist, I realized it is not some mysterious thing that is like lurking out in the shadows. Most of the students that I see who come to me with struggling readers have undiagnosed dyslexia. And when I was a classroom teacher, every year there were children in my classroom with dyslexia, whether I knew it or not. So I think if we can put that lens on right now and just instead of thinking that dyslexia is some hidden thing that we're not qualified to identify, I mean, technically we're not qualified to diagnose it, but we can see those characteristics and we can respond to them. We can alert the parents that we have concerns, that we're seeing signs of the dyslexic profile. So open yourself up to that mindset, because if we have that mindset, then we're going to be better at servicing students because we're going to take their struggles more seriously, and we're going to do a better job communicating with parents what's really happening and what resources they need to access. So let's be reading specialists for a minute here and break down that word dyslexia. Trouble with words. Dyslexia means trouble with words. Of course, the real definition of dyslexia goes so much deeper than that, and most people in the public, including many teachers in public schools, misunderstand and or don't feel comfortable with the word dyslexia and what that means. Most people still associate it with those reversals, B and D, and many people think that it has to be this horrific reading issue where you are years below grade level and you're struggling to sound out words. That's a poor understanding, because then that ignores all the students who do have a little bit of reading knowledge, but they're still struggling. So being able to identify dyslexia, even if you can't diagnose it, is important, because then you're going to be pointing parents in the right direction, and then you're going to be pointing yourself in the right direction as you understand their profile and plan their remediation. We used to think, and frankly many people still think, these following incorrect facts about dyslexia. Probably one of the worst things about dyslexia, or the worst misunderstanding about dyslexia, is that we can't diagnose it till later, like after first grade's completed, so second grade. So unfortunately, that goes against all the research that talks about early intervention. So if we have to wait until children are in second grade, 7 or 8 years old, then we've missed out on doing the right thing in first grade, in kindergarten, and even back in pre-K. I work with a lot of pre-K children, and I see I'm not certified as an early childhood teacher, but I work with a lot of pre-K children for enrichment purposes, and I can see when they're 4 and 5 years old who is showing those early signs, who has those red flags: trouble learning letters, unable to hear the first sound in words, unable to hear rhyme. All of those are red flags. Now, if I work with a child and they're making progress with it, that's different. But if I'm giving children weeks of really strong intervention work and they still, within one lesson, can't learn a letter name, or they can write the letters in their name, but they don't know the names of them, and then they can't recognize them elsewhere, those are all red flags. And then if you dig deeper in the family, you find out, oh yeah, their third grade brother has trouble reading and is a terrible speller. Oh yeah, their dad really struggled in school. So when you put all those things together, you realize, why are we waiting till second grade? We have all the red flags we need. We have the struggle in pre-K. Some kids also have a struggle with speech development. That could be part of something, not always related to dyslexia, but that could be part of it. We might see older siblings who are struggling. We might hear about a parent or an aunt and uncle or cousins who struggled. Red flags everywhere. Let's not wait until they're 7 or 8 and they've missed years of early intervention. Let's zoom in and do the right thing right away. Here is the big juicy definition of dyslexia. This definition was written by the IDA in 2002. Now, around, I want to say 2010, 2011, something like that, there was a shift in the APA or the DSM-5, right? The manual took dyslexia out and has changed it to just kept things general with specific learning disability. That was a huge hit for the field and for those in the dyslexic community, because now that word has been taken out of that manual and just it's left with a more generalized word, specific learning disability in reading. Specific learning disability is actually like it's not a very specific term at all. So in the special ed world, you still won't hear dyslexia, even though we're supposed to be using that. The federal government has given us permission to use the word dyslexia in IEPs, but for some reason that memo has not trickled down, and schools are still only using the term specific learning disability. That's why families often go outside of schools to get a neuropsych so that word dyslexia can show up on paper. Now, we all know about families who hire advocates and do all sorts of jump through all these crazy hoops and pay a lot of money just to get all this fancy stuff so they can get something in school that they may or may not need. I'm not talking about the politics of the family stuff. I'm talking about kids who truly have dyslexia and the school just can't understand or recognize it, and those families have to seek an outside neuropsych. And that connects to privilege, because families with economic means are able to do this. Families with resources that even know that this is an option to go get a neuropsych, they know to do this, but other families do not. This is not something that's they can access or afford, or that they even know to seek out. So there's a lot of privilege that gets connected with all this special ed and dyslexia stuff, which I'm sure you're aware of. Anyways, this is the definition we're going with. This is the definition that will fully help you to unpack the different characteristics of people with dyslexia. So first and foremost, I've highlighted the words neurobiological in origin. You need to know that you are born with dyslexia and it will not go away. It is in your brain. It is who you are. It's your wiring. Okay? That doesn't mean that you can't learn. Just because it's your wiring doesn't mean that you don't respond to outside influences like systematic and explicit teaching and Orton Gillingham. People with dyslexia do respond to that kind of teaching, but not just any old teaching will work. Because it's neurobiological, we have to be teaching with the brain in mind. We have to understand what are the differences in a dyslexic brain and how do we meet those needs, and how can we influence like the wiring or the pathways in the brain. So this is a direct copy and paste right from the IDA website. Some quick facts. If that definition was too much for you, that big paragraph, let's simplify it. First of all, it's a neurobiological. It's a difference in the brain. There's no cure for it, okay? It's not going away, but instead we can teach people with dyslexia how they best learn, and until they're old enough to do that, as teachers and parents, we can be the ones to make sure they get the right kind of instruction that targets their specific weaknesses. There is no relationship with dyslexia and intelligence. So this has nothing to do with low intelligence. Because you can't read even the simplest of words has nothing to do with how bright you are. Later on in this presentation, we're going to talk about the strengths that some dyslexic people have. Not everybody who has dyslexia has this above average, think outside the box mind. That is a strength that some people have, which is really interesting and amazing. But that there's not like this one size fits all dyslexic profile. So really what's most important is that teachers like you and me understand the variety of ways that dyslexia can kind of bubble out and interfere with children's learning. And then we can make a plan that supports them and their precise needs. Because some of our students are in 8th grade and still working on accurately reading little sight words like is and it, and sounding out words with long vowels, where some of our kids can handle that in 2nd grade, but their fluency is so terribly labored and their spelling is abysmal. So we're going to see the profile pop up in different ways. And that's what we have to understand. There's not one dyslexic profile. Okay. Like I said on the introduction slide, I want you to be comfortable accepting that dyslexia is everywhere. Wherever you work, in your social life, there are people with dyslexia who may or may not have been recognized. So people might not know it, but they might be able to describe a history of struggling with reading and writing, and they can probably tell you how they compensated and how they try to prevent their teachers and parents from noticing, how they tried to fake it. Maybe they'll talk about the special classroom that they were put in and all the special school and the tutors that their parents hired for them. There's all different histories that go with dyslexia. People are able to compensate and cope in different ways. But trust me that you have crossed paths with a lot of struggling readers in your life, whether or not you realize it. It doesn't matter if you work, in Lynn or in Newton. It doesn't matter where you work. It doesn't matter if the child speaks English as a native language or not. Dyslexia, we're going to see it present itself in about 15 to 20% of the population. So wherever you work, whoever you work with, it could be there. As you might remember from the Shaywitz book, there's a lot we know about dyslexia, and a lot of that came from fMRIs, functional MRIs, that kind of brain imaging. So whenever we talk about dyslexia, you're going to see the brain cut in half, and this is the left side of the brain, because that is the critical side for reading. That's where we're seeing things happen. So these are the 3 zones of the brain that you're going to always see over and over. This is from the Shaywitz's book, but you'll see this cited and referenced in a lot of books. It's in Mote's books as well, and I believe it's in your Birch book as well. So this image is what you need to know. Are we going to understand everything about the brain in neuroscience? No, but this is critical knowledge of the reading brain for a reading specialist like you. We have our articulation, our word analysis area. And then in the back, we have our word form area. The back of the brain, that occipitotemporal region, the back kind of left part of the brain, that is where skilled readers, that's the area that's activated the most, because skilled readers no longer are analyzing and sounding out words anymore. It's not that we've memorized words as whole. That's the critical thing. Skilled readers haven't memorized words. That would be the whole reading approach, right? Rather, skilled readers have mapped those sounds and symbols so many times, it's like they've mapped that. It's called orthographic mapping, and it goes like into the permanent zone. It's just like, I don't know, it's like muscle memory, but for words, if you think about it like that. We're still doing the act of seeing all those letters and associating them all with sounds, but it takes like, I don't know, nanoseconds, I don't know the terminology for how little time. It's seemingly automatic. And that's because those words that we've recognized have shifted. And you can see it with a typical student. Let's think of like a typical first grader. In the beginning of the year, they're sounding out words. By the end of the year, they don't need to sound out the word, let's say rat, because they see those letters, they rapidly recognize and understand. That has shifted from needing to be analyzed, and it shifts that kind of word to the back of the brain where it seems to be an automatic recognition. Now this is not how our children with dyslexia read. They're not using the most efficient areas of their brain. We can talk about like what lights up for them. Nothing's really lighting up in their brain. What's happening is that like blood is flowing to that area, and I think that's why it lights up on it appears to light up on the fMRI. So we need to shift our dyslexic students. They're not approaching the task of reading from the right way. We need to kind of like force their brain into looking at the pattern in words, because they're not seeing that pattern with the same kind of ease that another student is. The sounds, the phonological piece is huge. They're stuck there because that's where their weakness is. So the top image of the brain is a typical reader, somebody without dyslexia. We see a lot of activation. This is now like the top of the brain. We see a lot of activation in the back there. Whereas a dyslexic reader, there's too much happening in the front, and they're using both hemispheres of the brain. And some people say that that flexibility between the two hemispheres in the brain, that has all these amazing benefits for dyslexic students, and that's why we sometimes describe them as thinking outside the box or really good at big picture thoughts. So that's some people's idea on why some dyslexic students have those strengths. But that's a really inefficient way to read, and that's why even when we hear students who can read accurately, they're painfully slow with their reading because they're not using the most efficient way to read. So some of our students appear not to be dyslexic because we're like, well, they just read all those words correctly, but it's the labor and the effort that it took that should be alarming to us, and we should be able to see through that. Usually that's going to be matched with really poor spelling as well, and that's a signal to us. I'll say it again for the people in back. Dyslexia is inherited. You're born with it. It cannot be cured, but we can teach people with dyslexia to learn, to read. So if we have a deep understanding of what dyslexia is, then we can think about, well, what does our teaching need to look like? Let's go back to the definition of dyslexia. Okay, so now I'm zooming in on the people with dyslexia have difficulties with accurate and fluent word recognition or poor spelling and decoding. So that is I think pretty obvious. I think a lot of people know that this is part of that dyslexic profile. But let's zoom in on what this really means. Like I said in an earlier slide, there are different ways that dyslexia can present, and you might see some or all of these with your students with dyslexia. Difficulty reading single words, so words in a word list, sounding out those words when they're all by themselves out of context can be difficult. Difficulty decoding nonsense or unfamiliar words. Again, they could be relying on context clues or books that they've memorized to make it look like they're reading. And they're not doing this in a shifty, tricky kind of way. They're doing this just to compensate and keep their head above water. But that shows us that they don't have evidence of the code, right? Because if they can't sound out that new word or that nonsense word, they don't have that code that they're resting on. Sometimes their reading comprehension is amazing, and they're smart, and we wonder, well, they just are lazy. They just don't care about reading. Look how smart they are. They understand stuff, but they're just not trying. So sometimes student strengths can actually work against them and make it harder to convince the adults in their life that they're really struggling. Yet also comprehension can hugely be affected. They could be an intelligent child, yet we see that they have such poor comprehension skills, and we're wondering why when they can, speak so beautifully. And it's because their comprehension has been impacted by their poor decoding abilities, and therefore they don't get the story. That inaccurate or labored oral reading. So sometimes it is accurate, but incredibly labored or slow. That's a huge red flag, especially when we combine that labored reading with poor spelling. We're seeing how much effort and work it takes for them to guess and figure out what word comes next. And then we see when they try to spell, oh, they really don't have knowledge of the code, do they? Of course, inaccurate reading is a huge red flag too when we're seeing errors, when they can't sound out the words or the unknown words. That goes without saying. Another issue that many dyslexic children struggle with is trouble reading those small little function words or sight words, constantly tripping up over is, it, on, of, or, that kind of stuff, those ones that look similar and they're trying, there could be a multi-syllable word that they can sound out and chunk out through remediation, yet they still struggle with those little, like rapidly naming those tiny little sight words. Slow reading, poor spelling, those are the big ones. So sometimes benchmarks help us, but some of our students have managed to pass benchmarks by their compensatory strategies, and we need to go beyond looking at their dibbles. We need to analyze their reading, see how they approach a new text that they don't have any context for, and their spelling. Their spelling is often a window into their mind. Let's keep going with that definition. So dyslexia results in a deficit in the phonological component. This is something that I'm always telling families over the phone, because they'll tell me, well, he still, reverses his B's and D's, or he doesn't reverse his letters, so I don't think it's like dyslexia or anything. I often have to go back to say dyslexia, like the hallmark feature of dyslexia is issues with the phonological piece of the brain, phonological processing, memory, all of that piece. So let's talk more about what that means. Here's a quick review of my favorite, the reading rope. If I could get this like printed on a t-shirt, I would love it. I would wear it all the time. I feel like that would be so useful in being able to explain my job to families and being able to explain their child. So when we think about what we want, skilled reading, then we go down our rope and we see phonological awareness piece. If that strand is frayed or loose or weak, all of our efforts with skilled reading are undermined. Language comprehension can be strong, but if you have that weak phonological awareness loop, that's going to affect your decoding in a big way, and then you've got technically two strands there that are weak. So early in my career as a reading specialist, I was pretty simple-minded with my understanding of phonological issues. If a child was able to do the phoneme sequencing on their dibbles, I thought, oh, okay, that's fine. They're good with their phonological issues. This can't be dyslexia. I didn't realize I didn't really appreciate how that was just a quick dipstick, and that when we're looking at struggling readers and their phonological processing, yes, phoneme segmentation is one piece of it, but it's not in the entire piece. So we're also thinking about phonological retrieval and phonological memory. So the way that kids hold on to sounds and blend them together, that would be like that phonological memory. That's having them recode it. So they hear the sounds when they sound out the word b, r, sh, and then to be able to snap those back together in the same order takes some phonological awareness, but also memory. There's temporarily storing them. And then to retrieve that sound that they hear. So novel word repetition. Sometimes I'll have young students and I'll say a word like caterpillar, watermelon, investigate, and trying to see them mimic and repeat that word. If it's a novel word, that you can see the weakness there. So I'm not suggesting that this is a test, but it's almost more of a red flag. As a young child is learning a new word, for a 3-year-old, of course they might stumble over their syllables because it's developmentally appropriate for them to kind of struggle somewhat phonologically at that age. But when you're talking about a first grader and they can't echo the word investigate, you might not know what it means, but couldn't they just echo it? That's showing us that little phonological weakness. So sometimes in my in the reports that I write for parents when I'm doing testing, there's also a note about, through the lesson I heard them say and mispronounce these words. It doesn't mean they're dyslexic, but it's just another little red flag. It's just another little notation about issues they're having phonologically. Some children with speech articulation delays, that's just its own little thing. Both my girls have speech and articulation issues, but their phonological work is totally fine. So that was really encouraging for me to see when they were teeny and they were very late talkers, and I was very worried, and they're currently 6 and 4, and they each have a slew of articulation issues they're still working on. But when it comes to the phonological piece in terms of segmenting words, or segmenting sounds and words, hearing initial, medial, and final sounds, they're fine in that department. And if the novel word repetition, that one is lingering a little bit because of the artic issues. Yet, sometimes we see articulation issues and it's all woven into our students with dyslexia. So it's not that speech issues for sure point to dyslexia, and it's not that dyslexic kids have to have speech issues, but sometimes we see those both happen together, and that would not be surprising. If you're looking at a child, ages, let's say 4 through 8 or 4 through 9, when you see the phonological issues, that's a big red flag for dyslexia. So that's like the number one thing. Sometimes when I'm working with middle schoolers, I don't see as many phonological issues anymore. And it could be because they've been remediated. You know what I mean? They've had so many interventions for years that part's been cleaned up. And now what we're working on is orthography instead, the symbol piece. But that is like the number one thing to look for. So when we do our pretest for our students, we are going to be looking for this reading clinic, we're going to be looking at their phonological abilities. We want to select students that are having issues with phonological awareness, phonological memory, phonological processing. We're looking for those kinds of errors because that is the kind of struggling reader that I want you to learn from. So dyslexia is often unexpected. That means there isn't another reason why they're struggling. Okay, so it's not because they missed kindergarten and first grade due to illness. That would make me, I wouldn't think dyslexia. I've had students who have had childhood cancer and had a really spotty school attendance because of health reasons, and so they're struggling as a second grader and reading at a kindergarten level. That makes sense. There's a reason why they're struggling. If I intervened for a long time and I wasn't seeing progress, then I would be alarmed and, look into understanding if it was dyslexia or a reading disability. But if there's a reason why they're struggling, an obvious reason, we don't need to jump right to dyslexia. I would still actually remediate the same way with something like Orton-Gillingham or structured literacy, because I know that's the best way to teach children, especially young children on the cusp of learning how to read. But I don't need to jump to dyslexia right away because there are other reasons. Likewise, if they are learning English as a second language, that it's tricky in the beginning to realize, okay, is this because they're learning a new language, or is this because there's a reading disability? So there are times when we can't quite hash it out yet. Or same with ADHD. They got an ADHD diagnosis at the end of first grade and they're a struggling reader. Well, is that because for kindergarten and first grade they were kind of misunderstood and we didn't have the right strategies in place to support them and they basically missed instruction for a couple of years? Or is there also dyslexia going on? And those two highly co-occur, so that could be a process too. It could also be, were they in a classroom where they were taught whole language, or the Reading and Writers Workshop in Lucy Calkins in kindergarten where they only taught sight words? And then they come to me for tutoring and I realize, oh, nobody's just taught them to sound out a word. It was just all memory. No wonder they can't read. They've just been trying to memorize everything they read and guess from pictures. So those are the kinds of things that we'd want to cross out or eliminate when we're trying to support families in understanding their struggling student. If we want to get to the root of it, we want to make sure there's no other reason why they're struggling.
Continuing on with the definition of dyslexia. Now I've highlighted that dyslexia might include some secondary consequences. So while these characteristics aren't the root cause of dyslexia. They are the side effects of having dyslexia. For example, reading comprehension issues. That makes sense because if when you are reading on your own independently and it takes so much effort to read and you're making errors, or even if you're accurate but it just takes so much effort, you're putting all your cognitive power towards the act of decoding and figuring out what the words are, either by guessing or using syntax clues in the sentence structure, or looking up at the picture to see what makes sense. You're using all that power and it's all taken up time that isn't being spent on comprehension. We want our readers to be able to do things so quickly and efficiently that their brains are left with power to dive deep into the text and understand it. That's the point, to actively engage. But our struggling readers, our dyslexic students, are not able to do that. So sometimes we'll see that comprehension piece be a huge weakness, and we don't have to have it cloud our vision when we're trying to understand what the real root of the problem is. If you look at the kinds of errors they're making while reading, or if the reading is accurate but we see lots of errors in their spelling, and then we see phonological issues when we test them, then we can see, okay, this is looking like a dyslexic profile where the reading comprehension isn't the root of the issue, rather just a side effect. Likewise, our struggling readers are spending less time reading text each day, or they're spending less time reading complex text. So if you think about those children who are struggling in first, second, and third grade and are barely exposed to anything because the books they do in their reading groups are so shrimpy, like these little low-level decodable books, or even if they're in a balanced literacy classroom and it's guided reading, they're at the upper end of the alphabet in terms of reading level, and it's just a really limited language that they're exposed to, and they're just working at that level over and over. They're missing out on being exposed to a richer, wide array of vocabulary words. And on any given day, that might not seem like such a big deal, but when you look at day after day for an entire school year, that adds up to a lot of missed opportunities. So again, you're going to see limits with these students and their vocabulary knowledge and perhaps even their background knowledge, because what they read, they're just so limited. One way to combat this, of course, is to make sure that rich read-alouds continue to happen in our classrooms and in our homes through all of elementary school and middle school. We still want to be reading to kids. We should always be reading to them above their decoding and fluency level so that they continue to be able to develop deep critical thinking skills and are exposed to lots of vocabulary. It's especially critical for our struggling students. The kids that I see as struggling readers, I'm often using decodable text with them or very controlled and low-level text. And when parents say, what can I do at home? The easiest thing to recommend is that they continue to read deep, engaging, interesting, fascinating literature at home with their kids. So they might not be able to do complex phonological awareness tasks or explain, the ins and outs of phonics and word attack, but I can say the time that you read with your child at night is valuable, and here's why. And I think sometimes parents think that reading time at home, from first grade on, that kids should be doing all the reading. Of course, we want our children to practice their reading, but for our struggling readers who just spent hours that day with tutors and in the resource room and with a SPED teacher, we also want them to just be read too, to associate reading as something lovely and enjoyable, and then to also have an opportunity to grow their vocabulary, which impacts their comprehension. Well, there we go. It looks like that slide was out of order, but there we have it again. That bit about vocabulary and background knowledge is right there in our definition of dyslexia as a secondary consequence. So we've unpacked that definition of dyslexia. Something that Sally Shaywitz introduces in her book, Overcoming Dyslexia, which you might remember, is the Sea of Strength model. So the idea is that, yes, there's a very specific weakness in phonological skills and decoding, yet some of our dyslexic students have some really interesting strengths, which we would want to, I guess, draw attention to and help them appreciate about in themselves. So sometimes with a dyslexic profile, we also see this sort of flexibility in thinking that allows for great problem solving. We often call it like thinking outside the box. And you'll hear in the news or in the media like these, I don't know, people like Elon Musk or whoever, like real outside the box thinkers who have dyslexia, and you can see, wow, okay, like look at these people have overcome their difficulties and this flexible way that they have of thinking about things, which does not lend well to the code of the English language, lends itself really well to being an innovator and a problem solver. I've had the students that I've worked with that they've gone on to high school and college, and watching them over the years when they're done with tutoring, and I can see, or they're done being my student, and I get reports from their families about what they've pursued, and it's so encouraging to see, you know, they've moved into engineering or woodworking and design, and seeing these really cool things that these kids do. Yet there's a downside to painting this really cheery picture of students with dyslexia having this really these really amazing thinking patterns, and we'll get into that on the next slide. So this is an info graphic, is that what they're called, from IDA, International Dyslexia Association, just kind of dealing with this idea that sometimes gets played up a lot, like, ooh, dyslexia, it's a gift, and, you know, dyslexia is my superpower, and there are advantages to having this kind of brain, and we certainly want to empower people who have this kind of, you know, neural diversity. We want to support them because there's not one right kind of brain to have. Every human brain is very different, and it just so happens that brains that are wired like this don't do so well with this code of the alphabetic code. Now, alphabetic code is not a requirement to being a human, you know, and interacting. We're not born with, you know, a reading center in our brain. It's just so that we've invented over thousands, millions, I don't know, of years, this code of language, and ours, the English language, is based on sound symbol relationships. And so if you have a brain that has trouble with those kinds of arbitrary things, then this is going to be hard for you. Yeah, you might have all these other cognitive gifts. So that's great. That's really great to build that up for kids. And I do that. But I only do that once I can see a legitimate strength that a child has. I don't want to paint this rosy picture of, yay, this is a blessing for you, because I think that undermines all the hard work that they have ahead of them as a dyslexic student in a world that requires a pretty high level of literacy. And I think it can be discouraging when they find out that, oh, actually they struggle with comprehension and math and science too. So let's not put all dyslexics in one box. And although there are strengths that are associated with that profile, let's not assume all of our students have that. So the ideas that I covered in the last slide, you can see here as well. There's not a lot of evidence talking about this dyslexic brain and all of its strengths and its open-endedness. There's not a lot of evidence there. So I don't think we need to go too far down that. I don't think we need to spend too much time thinking about that. I think the best thing we can do as educators with our particular role is make sure that our students get the very best instruction that matches their specific needs, and to support them and encourage them as humans. So regardless if the strengths they have are connected to dyslexia or not, we can value them as human beings and pump them up that way. And if we happen to notice the correlations with, you know, this kind of dyslexic profile, like all these advantages, then sure, let's point that out and let's build them up and get them to feel empowered about their profile. But most importantly, let's match them with the right intervention. I just keep getting ahead of myself on these slides. So there it is again. As reading specialists, we are advocates for our struggling readers and those with dyslexia. We want to inform and empower the parents and the kids because this is a long-term thing. Dyslexia is not going to be cured, but they do respond to instruction. People with dyslexia do respond to instruction when it's the right kind. And that's what we're here to do. So I'm opening this course, this reading clinic where we're trained in Orton Gillingham with some special attention on dyslexia, because you can't appreciate the purpose of Orton Gillingham without understanding our clientele. So Orton Gillingham and those principles can be applied to the general population in your general ed classroom. They can be applied to struggling readers who aren't dyslexic but struggle for other reasons, like they've missed out on teaching in the early years, or they're learning English as a second language, or whatever. So these structured literacy principles found in OG can be applied to the general population, but they are critical for our struggling students and our dyslexic readers. Diagnosed or undiagnosed, OG is the way to go. You will be grateful for your OG mindset, which you can apply to your struggling students. All right, let's move on.